Power alone does not decide this battle, and that's the part most people miss. The moment that truly shifts everything here isn't about who hits harder, but about whose will bends the structure of the fight itself. Future Trunks versus Goku Black looks like a clash of raw strength on the surface, but underneath, it's a collision between inevitability and resistance, where every swing carries the weight of a ruined timeline. Nothing about this confrontation is stable. Power scales distort, strategy collapses under emotion, and the cost of hesitation becomes permanent. This is not a fight that asks who is stronger. It asks what kind of strength survives when the future is already broken. Future Trunks enters this conflict carrying more than a sword. He carries a timeline that has already failed him once. Every decision he makes is shaped by loss that cannot be undone, cities erased, people who never get a second chance. That context matters, because it reframes his power. Trunks is not chasing victory in the traditional Dragon Ball sense. He's chasing correction. Against Goku Black, that difference becomes critical. Black doesn't just want to win. He wants to validate his ideology, to prove that mortals are inherently flawed and deserve erasure. So when these two collide, it isn't just energy against energy. It's purpose against belief. Goku Black's strength is deceptive in how it functions. It's not static. It grows through conflict, adapts through pain, sharpens through repetition. He learns by being hurt, and that makes every exchange dangerous. Fighting him head-on feeds the very system that empowers him. That's why this battle feels so suffocating. Every time Trunks pushes forward, the margin for error shrinks. Every hesitation gives Black more room to evolve. The power scaling here isn't linear. It's predatory. Black doesn't overpower opponents immediately. He outlasts them, waits for their resolve to crack, and then escalates beyond their expectations. Trunks knows this, even if he can't articulate it fully. You can hear it in his restraint, in the way he fights with urgency, but not recklessness. He's seen what happens when power is pursued without control. He watched it destroy his future once already. That's why his style here is different from the scions around him. He doesn't revel in combat. He compresses it. Every strike is aimed at ending the fight sooner rather than proving dominance. That makes his presence feel desperate, but also focused. He's not fighting for pride. He's fighting for permission for the future to exist at all. The Sword of Light doesn't emerge as a sudden power-up in a vacuum. It's the culmination of something Dragon Ball rarely lingers on, but quietly builds toward here: collective belief. Trunks' power in this moment isn't sourced purely from ki in the traditional sense. It's drawn from connection, from the remaining fragments of humanity that still trust him to protect what's left. That's why this power feels different from transformations like Super Saiyan Blue or Rose. It doesn't amplify his body so much as it reframes his role. He stops being just another fighter in the arc and becomes a focal point for resistance itself. From a strategy standpoint, this changes the geometry of the fight. Goku Black thrives in prolonged exchanges where adaptation is possible. The Sword of Light compresses time. It turns the battle into a narrowing corridor, reducing Black's ability to experiment, to evolve safely. This is where narrative weight overrides raw mechanics. The attack isn't dangerous because it's stronger. It's dangerous because it denies Black the one advantage he's relied on since his introduction: the luxury of time. And that's why Black reacts the way he does. Not with fear, but with offense intensified. He doesn't retreat from this shift. He tries to overwhelm it, to flood the moment with force before its meaning can settle. That response tells you everything about his character. He cannot tolerate a symbol that contradicts his worldview. A mortal wielding hope as a weapon is, to him, an error that must be erased immediately. The fight accelerates not because the story needs spectacle, but because ideologies are colliding faster than either side can stabilize. For Trunks, the emotional toll compounds with every second. He's not just maintaining power. He's holding together the idea that struggle is still valid. That pressure bleeds into his movements, into the way his attacks carry less flourish and more finality. He isn't testing Black anymore. He's committing. And commitment in Dragon Ball is dangerous because it removes the safety net of escalation. Once you choose to end things, there's no room left to adapt if it fails. This is where the battle stops resembling a typical Dragon Ball Z power exchange and starts functioning like a thesis statement for the future Trunks arc. Survival here is not guaranteed by strength alone. It's dictated by whether conviction can momentarily outweigh inevitability. The Sword of Light isn't just aimed at Goku Black. It's aimed at the assumption that the future must repeat its own destruction. And as the clash intensifies, the question isn't whether Trunks can cut down his opponent, but whether this kind of power can exist in a universe that constantly corrects itself toward collapse. Because the moment he swings, everything he believes about justice, sacrifice, and the value of resistance is tested against an enemy that has never once accepted the legitimacy of mortal hope. And that tension keeps tightening as the distance between them closes, forcing the fight toward a point where either meaning or annihilation has to give. That tightening pressure is exactly why this confrontation lingers longer than most fights in the Dragon Ball Super Future Trunks arc. As the clash escalates, power becomes less readable. The usual visual language of dominance, transformations, clean hierarchies of strength starts to break down. Goku Black's rose form still radiates superiority, but it no longer guarantees control. The Sword of Light introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is the one variable Black consistently underestimates. He assumes power explains everything. He assumes conviction is cosmetic. Trunks challenges that assumption simply by continuing to stand. What makes this moment resonate is how clearly Trunks understands the cost of failure. This isn't a theoretical loss. He's already lived the aftermath of defeat. He knows what comes after cities fall quiet and resistance disappears. That awareness sharpens his focus in a way that raw Saiyan instinct never could. While Black grows stronger through damage, Trunks grows more precise through desperation. His movements stop reacting and start anticipating. He doesn't wait for openings. He creates them, even if it means exposing himself, because prolonging the fight only favors his opponent. From a power scaling perspective, this is where the fight becomes deliberately uncomfortable. If you try to quantify Trunks' strength here using traditional metrics, it doesn't add up cleanly. He shouldn't be able to contest someone who has matched gods and evolved through repeated combat with Super Saiyan Blue. And yet, he does. Not because the numbers suddenly change, but because the conditions do. Dragon Ball has always allowed emotion to distort limits, but here it's more specific than rage. It's resolve under extinction. Trunks isn't drawing strength from anger alone. He's drawing it from responsibility, from the collective weight of everyone who can't fight anymore. Goku Black senses this distortion but refuses to acknowledge its legitimacy. To him, this kind of power is a flaw in the system, an anomaly that shouldn't exist. That's why his attacks become more excessive, more punishing, less refined. He stops testing and starts erasing. He wants the moment gone before it can redefine the rules he believes govern existence. That shift subtly weakens him. Not in raw output, but in clarity. His strikes gain force, but lose efficiency. He commits more energy than necessary, trying to crush meaning instead of dismantling resistance. Trunks, by contrast, becomes quieter as the fight peaks. His expressions harden, his breathing steadies, and the spectacle around him feels almost secondary. This calm isn't confidence. It's acceptance. He knows there may not be another chance. That knowledge strips away hesitation. When he advances with the Sword of Light, it's not as a warrior seeking triumph, but as a survivor choosing consequence over regret. That distinction matters because it reframes the act itself. Winning becomes less important than acting at all. Narratively, this is the point where the future Trunks saga reveals its core tragedy. Even at his strongest, even when backed by belief and collective hope, Trunks is still fighting inside a system stacked against permanence. The universe of Dragon Ball Super doesn't reward sacrifice with stability. It rewards it with moments, brief windows where meaning can assert itself before being overwritten. The Sword of Light represents one of those windows. It doesn't promise a restored future. It promises a refusal to surrender quietly. That's why this fight doesn't resolve with clean catharsis. The emotional payoff isn't in domination. It's in defiance. Trunks doesn't invalidate Goku Black's power. He challenges the inevitability Black represents. For a brief span of time, The idea that mortals are disposable is forced to confront resistance strong enough to scar even a god's borrowed form. That scar is psychological as much as physical. Black is shaken not because he's hurt, but because something he considers inferior dares to stand without collapsing. As the clash pushes toward its breaking point, the energy between them stops feeling like a duel and starts feeling like a verdict in motion. Every exchange compresses the future further, narrowing outcomes until only extremes remain. Either the sword of light proves that shared will can cut through divine arrogance, or it confirms Black's belief that all resistance is temporary noise. Trunks commits fully, knowing that even if this strike fails, it will still define the moment humanity refused to fade quietly. And that commitment carries him forward as the pressure peaks, the distance closes to nothing, and the battle approaches a resolution that was never meant to be clean, final, or comforting, because in this timeline, survival itself has always been an unfinished argument. That unfinished argument is what makes the Sword of Light resonate beyond the mechanics of the fight. It isn't a technique meant to be replicated or scaled forward into future arcs. It exists only here, under these conditions, because it is born from circumstances that cannot be recreated. A broken world, a dwindling population, a fighter who has already lost everything except the right to choose how it ends. Dragon Ball Super rarely allows a power to be this contextual, and that's why this moment feels so fragile. Remove the pressure, remove the stakes, and it collapses. Goku Black never truly understands that fragility. He interprets resistance as defiance, defiance as arrogance, and arrogance as something to be corrected through overwhelming force. What he fails to grasp is that Trunks isn't trying to assert superiority. He's trying to assert meaning. That difference creates a misalignment in how they read each other's actions. Black escalates to dominate. Trunks escalates to conclude. One seeks continuation through destruction. The other seeks closure through action. In a universe that constantly resets through higher authorities and cosmic intervention, that desire for closure becomes quietly radical. From a thematic standpoint, this is where the future Trunks arc diverges from the rest of Dragon Ball Super. Most conflicts resolve by surpassing a limit and stabilizing into a new normal. This one refuses to stabilize. Even at its peak, even with Trunks wielding power that visibly rivals divine energy, the future remains uncertain. The Sword of Light doesn't solve the timeline. It exposes how unsustainable it already is. That's why the emotional weight lingers after the clash itself. You're left with the sense that something important happened, even if it didn't fix everything. In terms of character growth, Trunks reaches a kind of maturity that no transformation could grant him. He stops measuring himself against gods, against his father's legacy, against the expectations of what a scion should become. Instead, he defines himself by responsibility. He accepts that strength is temporary, but action is permanent. That realization changes how his power manifests. It's no longer about breaking limits. It's about choosing a line and standing on it, even when the ground beneath it is already collapsing. Goku Black, meanwhile, exposes the weakness in his philosophy through his reaction. For someone who claims to represent divine order, he is remarkably threatened by disorder that he cannot control. The Sword of Light isn't dangerous because it might kill him. It's dangerous because it introduces a form of power that doesn't fit into his hierarchy. A power that doesn't come from godhood, stolen bodies, or perfected ideology, but from flawed beings refusing to disappear. That contradiction destabilizes him more than any blow. This is why the battle feels less like a climax and more like a confrontation with consequences. No matter how it resolves, nothing returns to equilibrium. The future cannot simply move on. The damage is too deep, the loss is too complete. Trunks' stand doesn't erase that truth. It acknowledges it. And in doing so, it reframes heroism in Dragon Ball Super as something quieter and more painful. Not the promise of a happy ending, but the refusal to let despair go unchallenged. As the energy between them reaches its breaking point, the Sword of Light becomes less a weapon and more a statement etched into the flow of the timeline itself. It says that even in a universe governed by gods, erasure is not absolute. That resistance, however brief, can still matter. And while the outcome may not grant Trunks the future he fought for, It ensures that the final shape of that future is not decided without him standing against it, sword raised, while intact, forcing the conflict to resolve not on Black's terms, but on the undeniable truth that survival is sometimes defined not by victory, but by the moment you choose to confront annihilation head-on and refuse to look away. And that refusal is ultimately what separates this battle from every other confrontation built on spectacle alone. When the dust settles on this moment in the future Trunks arc, what remains isn't a clean hierarchy of strength or a new benchmark for power scaling. What remains is the impression left by a choice. Trunks doesn't walk away as the strongest fighter in the room. He walks away as someone who forced a godlike enemy to acknowledge resistance as more than background noise. That alone reshapes the emotional geometry of the story. The Sword of Light never becomes a legacy technique, never turns into a repeatable solution for future threats, and that impermanence is the point. It exists as proof that context can elevate a fighter beyond their expected limits. Not forever, but exactly when it matters most. Goku Black represents inevitability weaponized, a future where struggle is meaningless because outcomes are predetermined by divine judgment. Trunks represents the opposite, the idea that even a doomed future deserves to be fought for, if only to assert that it was not surrendered willingly. In that sense, this fight is less about defeating Goku Black and more about interrupting his narrative. Trunks doesn't disprove Black's power. He disrupts his certainty. And in Dragon Ball Super, where gods, angels, and timelines constantly assert control, that disruption carries more weight than another transformation ever could. The Sword of Light becomes a punctuation mark in a sentence that was never meant to end neatly, a moment where human resolve cuts across cosmic arrogance long enough to leave a mark. That's why this clash continues to resonate. Not because it rewrites the rules of the universe, but because it exposes how fragile those rules become when confronted by someone who has already accepted loss and chooses to fight anyway. Future Trunks vs. Goku Black is remembered not as a victory, but as a stand, and in a world defined by destruction and reset buttons, that stand becomes one of the most quietly powerful statements Dragon Ball Super ever allows itself to make.